A novel by Orville Mills. Chapter 1. Into the Unknown. The Wanderer rocked gently against the waves, its hull groaning as if protesting the journey. Captain Elias Draven stood on the bridge, one hand gripping the ship's wheel and the other clutching his ever-present thermos of coffee. His brow furrowed in concentration as he stared into the endless grey horizon. The fishing trawler had never been this far from their usual grounds before, but desperation had a way of pushing even the most seasoned sailors into uncharted waters. Still nothing. Elias barked, his gravelly voice cutting through the static of the radio. The reply crackled back from below deck, where Henry, the young deckhand, was monitoring the fish finder. "No, sir. Same as the last few hours. Empty." His voice carried an undertone of unease. Elias cursed under his breath and set the thermos down with a heavy thud. They'd been out for 2 weeks already and hadn't come close to meeting their usual haul. Back at port, his competitors were hauling in less and less each season, the fishing grounds thinning like a receding tide. But Elias had staked his reputation and his livelihood on the Wanderer. He wasn't about to limp back to shore empty-handed. Not again. The crew had voiced their concerns earlier that morning. They'd argued it wasn't worth it, that the open ocean didn't take kindly to foolhardy captains. But Elias had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let superstition or the wary looks in their eyes deter him. "Keep the nets ready," Elias called, his voice firm. "We keep heading north. There's gotta be something out here." Behind him, the first mate, Jonas, leaned against the doorway to the bridge. A wiry man with salt and pepper hair and a permanent scowl, Jonas had sailed with Elias for nearly a decade. He didn't say anything, but the look he gave Elias spoke volumes. "You've got something to say, Jonas, say it," Elias growled without turning. Jonas sighed and stepped forward, folding his arms. "You know the crew's nervous." "Hell, I'm nervous. We're not just out of our usual waters, we're out of everyone's waters. Nobody comes this far north, Elias. There's a reason for that." Elias tightened his grip on the wheel. "Superstitious nonsense. I'm not turning back because a few greenhorns are scared of shadows." Jonas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the choppy waters. "It's not just the crew, capital look at the sea. It's different out here." Elias followed his gaze. The ocean stretched out in every direction, a dull, unbroken expanse of steel-grey waves. It looked the same as it always had to him, but Jonas was right about one thing: there was something unsettling about the stillness. The waves didn't lap and crash like they should have. They simply moved, sluggish and heavy, like a great beast shifting in its sleep. "I've been sailing these waters for 40 years, Jonas continued. "And I've never felt it like this. It's like it's watching us." Elias snorted, trying to hide the unease creeping up his spine. "The sea doesn't watch, Jonas. It's just water. Now get back to work and make sure the boys are ready when we hit something." Jonas hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod and left the bridge. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He shook his head, trying to push the doubts aside. He was a man of logic, a man who trusted hard work and experience over old wives' tales. The sea didn't watch, and it certainly didn't care. Still, as the hours dragged on and the Wanderer pushed farther north, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that Jonas might be right. The water was changing. It was darker now, almost black in places, and the sky above seemed lower, the clouds pressing down as if trying to smother the horizon. By nightfall, the crew's murmurs had grown louder. Down in the galley, Henry, Mike, and a few others sat around the bolted-down table, picking at their dinners. "I'm telling you, it's bad luck to come this far," Henry said, his voice low. "My old man always said the further north you go, the worse the sea gets. He used to talk about sailors disappearing out here, whole ships, gone without a trace." Mike, the burly deckhand who rarely spoke, finally chimed in. "And what would they disappear to, Henry? Mermaids? Ghosts?" He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The only thing out here is fish. Or lack of em." Henry scowled. "Laugh all you want, but something doesn't feel right. I'm not the only one who feels it, either." He glanced around the table, and a few of the men nodded in agreement. The galley door swung open, and Jonas stepped in. The crew fell silent. The first mate surveyed them, his expression unreadable. "Finish your meals and get some rest," he said finally. "We're pulling an all-hands watch tonight." Henry frowned. "All hands? Why? Is something?" "Because the captain says so," Jonas interrupted sharply. "Now eat." Up on the deck, Elias stood alone at the bow, staring into the black water. The sky was moonless, the stars faint and scattered like shards of broken glass. The ocean below seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, an inky void that stretched endlessly. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to wonder if he'd made a mistake. A sound broke through the stillness, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to rise from the depths. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver through him. He glanced around, but there was nothing, only the waves and the empty horizon. He shook his head and turned back toward the bridge. Whatever it was just his mind playing tricks on him. They'd find the fish soon. They had to. Chapter 2, Stranger Waters. The dawn came reluctantly, a pale grey light seeping into the overcast sky. The wanderer cut through the rolling waves with the sluggish determination of a beast well past its prime. On the bridge, Captain Elias Draven leaned heavily against the ship's wheel, his bloodshot eyes scanning the horizon. He had barely slept. The strange thrum from the night before still lingered in his mind, though he hadn't heard it again. "Anything?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Below deck, Henry's response crackled over the intercom. "No, sir. Same as last night, just noise." Elias frowned. "What kind of noise?" There was a pause before Henry replied. "Static. The fish finder keeps jumping, like something's messing with the signal. But I'm not picking up any fish." Elias muttered a curse under his breath and clicked off the intercom. He glanced out the window again, his unease growing. The water had changed overnight. It was darker now, not just in color, but in depth, as if the ocean beneath them had suddenly become impossibly vast. The waves seemed sluggish, their movements unnatural and heavy. "Jonas," Elias called. The first mate appeared a moment later, his face set in its usual grim lines. "Problem?" Jonas asked. Elias gestured out the window. "What do you make of that?" Jonas frowned and stepped closer to the glass. His eyes scanned the water, narrowing as he took in the strange movements of the waves. "Looks like a current," he said finally. "A strong one. Then why isn't it showing up on the charts?" Elias demanded. "We're off the usual routes, sure, but this far north? We should be in calm waters." Jonas didn't reply. Instead, he crossed to the radar and studied the screen. The usual clutter of signals was there: waves, wind, the occasional echo from the ship's own movement, but something else caught his attention. A faint, irregular blip hovered near the edge of the radar's range. "You see that?" Jonas asked, pointing. Elias stepped over and squinted at the screen. "What is it?" "Could be another ship," Jonas said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or maybe a pod of whales." Elias shook his head. "Too stationary. Whatever it is, it's not moving." Jonas hesitated, then turned to face him. "Could be nothing. A false reading." "But," he trailed off, his expression uneasy. "But what?" Elias pressed. Jonas shrugged. "I don't know. It just doesn't feel right." Before Elias could respond, a shout came from above deck. Both men turned and hurried outside, their boots thudding against the metal stairs. "What's going on?" Elias barked as he reached the deck. Henry was leaning over the railing, his face pale. He pointed out to the water, his hand trembling. "Look." Elias followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. The ocean was alive with lights. Pale blue and green glows flickered beneath the surface, swirling and darting like fireflies. They were everywhere, stretching as far as the eye could see. "What the hell is that?" Jonas muttered. "Bioluminescence," Elias said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Plankton, maybe." "Plankton don't move like that," Henry said. "And they don't watch." Elias glanced at the young deckhand sharply. "What are you talking about?" Henry didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the water, where one of the lights had risen closer to the surface. It hovered there for a moment, pulsing faintly, before disappearing into the depths. The rhythmic thrum from the night before returned, louder this time. It seemed to vibrate through the ship itself, a deep, resonant sound that made the deck plates hum underfoot. The crew exchanged nervous glances, and even Jonas looked unsettled. "It's just the current," Elias said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Everyone back to work. Get the nets ready, we're not going home empty-handed." The crew hesitated, but a sharp glare from Elias sent them scurrying to their posts. Only Jonas remained by his side, his expression grim. "You sure about this, Cap?" Jonas asked quietly. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. As the day wore on, the strangeness only deepened. The lights beneath the water seemed to follow the wanderer, keeping pace with the trawler no matter how far it traveled. The rhythmic thrum grew louder, a constant undercurrent of sound that made it impossible to relax. The fish finder continued to give erratic readings, flickering between static and bursts of nonsensical data. By mid-afternoon, the crew's nerves were fraying. One of the men, a wiry deckhand named Bill, stormed into the galley and slammed his fists on the table. "This is madness," he shouted. "We're chasing ghosts out here. The ocean doesn't want us here, and we're too damn stubborn to listen." Mike, the burly deckhand, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "What do you expect us to do? Swim back to shore?" "We should turn around," Bill insisted. "Before it's too late. And explain to the captain why we're cutting the trip short." Mike shot back. "Be my guest." Bill glared at him but didn't reply. Instead, he turned and stalked out of the galley, muttering under his breath. That night, Elias stood alone on the bridge, staring out at the black water. The lights were still there, flickering just beneath the surface, but now they seemed closer. The rhythmic thrum had become almost deafening, a steady pulse that seemed to echo inside his skull. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "We'll find the fish," he muttered to himself. "We have to." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by another ship, or by the creatures in the water, but by the ocean itself. The wanderer pressed on into the night, the strange lights and sounds of the uncharted waters its only companions. Chapter 3, The Hall. The morning of the third day dawned in eerie silence. The rhythmic thrum that had plagued the wanderer for the past 2 days was gone, leaving behind a hollow stillness that felt almost worse. The crew moved about the deck with a mixture of relief and tension, their boots clanging against the damp metal as they prepared the nets. "Looks like things are finally settling down," Jonas muttered as he joined Elias on the bridge. Elias didn't reply immediately. He was staring at the fish finder, which had suddenly started giving readings again. Large, dense clusters of movement filled the screen, forming a massive, pulsing school that stretched across the radar's range. "Settling down?" Elias said finally, his voice low. "Take a look at this." Jonas leaned over the console, his eyes widening as he took in the data. That's got to be a glitch," he said. "Nothing that big swims together." Elias shook his head. "It's no glitch. The readings are steady. Whatever it is, it's real." Jonas frowned. "And you want to haul it in? That's what we're here for, isn't it?" Elias snapped. "Fish like that could feed the whole damn fleet for weeks. We're not turning back now." Jonas hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get the crew ready." The deck of the Wanderer was a hive of activity as the crew prepared the nets. The atmosphere was charged, a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't deny the sheer size of the reading on the radar. "It's like a gold mine," Henry said, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "We haul this in, and we're set for life. Assuming we make it back," Bill muttered under his breath, earning a glare from Mike. "Quit your whining," Mike said. "This is what we signed up for. Now get to work." Elias watched from the bridge, his hands gripping the wheel as he steered the Wanderer toward the heart of the massive school. The water was unnaturally calm, the waves barely lapping against the hull as the ship approached its target. "Drop the nets," Elias barked over the intercom. The crew moved quickly, the heavy trawling nets sliding over the side of the ship and sinking into the depths. The winches groaned as the cables unspooled, the machinery straining under the weight of the gear. For a few tense moments, nothing happened. Then, the lines went taut. "We've got something," Henry shouted, his voice rising above the noise of the winches. The deck erupted into a flurry of activity as the crew worked to secure the lines. The Wanderer shuddered under the strain, its engines groaning as they fought to maintain position against the weight of the catch. "Steady," Jonas yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Keep it steady." Elias watched from the bridge, his heart pounding. The radar was alive with movement, the massive school of fish swarming around the nets like a living tide. He could feel the excitement building in his chest, the anticipation of a haul unlike anything they'd ever seen before. But as the nets began to rise, something strange happened. The water around the ship started to churn, bubbling and frothing as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. "What the hell is that?" Mike shouted, pointing toward the water. The crew froze, their eyes fixed on the roiling sea. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with a deafening roar, the surface exploded. The first thing they saw was the fish, thousands of them, thrashing and writhing in the nets as they were hauled toward the surface. But these weren't the cod and haddock the crew was used to. These fish were massive, their scales shimmering with iridescent colors that seemed to shift and change in the light. Their eyes were huge and glassy, glowing faintly in the dimness. "What in God's name?" Jonas muttered, his voice trailing off. The nets strained under the weight, the cables groaning as the winches struggled to lift the catch. The crew moved cautiously, their excitement giving way to unease as they took in the strange, alien fish. "Keep hauling," Elias shouted from the bridge. "We've got them now." But as the nets rose higher, the churning water grew more violent. Shapes began to emerge from the depths, massive, shadowy forms that moved with an unnatural grace. The crew stared in stunned silence as the creatures came into view. They were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Their bodies were sleek and sinuous, covered in scales that glowed with the same eerie light as the fish. Long, fin-like appendages extended from their sides, and their eyes were huge and unblinking, radiating an intense, otherworldly intelligence. One of the creatures swam close to the ship, its massive head breaking the surface. It let out a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the water and air, sending a chill down the spines of everyone on board. "Pull the nets in," Jonas shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Now." The crew sprang into action, their fear giving them new urgency. The winches whined as they worked to haul the nets up, the heavy cables straining under the weight. But it was too late. The first breach came without warning. One of the watertight compartments on the port side began to flood, the water pouring in with alarming speed. "We're taking on water," Henry yelled, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Elias cursed and slammed his fist against the console. "Jonas, get the pumps running." Jonas nodded and disappeared below deck, shouting orders as he went. The crew scrambled to secure the nets, their movements frantic as the ship listed to one side. "Cut the lines," Bill shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "We have to let it go." "Not yet," Elias bellowed. "We're not leaving without the haul." But even as he spoke, the second compartment flooded. The Wanderer groaned under the strain, its hull creaking as the water rose. On the bridge, Elias stared out at the sea, his mind racing. He had pushed them too far, he realized. He had ignored the warnings, dismissed the fears of his crew, and now they were paying the price. "Pull it in," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Pull it in, and we'll go." The nets rose higher, the alien fish and glowing creatures thrashing within them. The crew worked feverishly, their fear and desperation driving them forward. But deep down, Elias knew it wouldn't be enough. Chapter 4, The Flooding. The Wanderer groaned like a wounded beast, its aging hull creaking under the strain of both the massive haul in the nets and the water rushing into its compartments. The first mate, Jonas, bolted up from below deck, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "3 compartments are flooding," he shouted over the chaos on the deck. "Port side. Pumps can't keep up." Elias gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as he tried to stabilize the ship against the churning waves. The Wanderer was listing dangerously to port, its engines groaning as the weight of the flooding compartments threatened to drag it under. "Shut the damn compartments off," Elias yelled. "I can't," Jonas barked back. "The bulkheads aren't sealing properly, too much pressure." The rest of the crew worked frantically to secure the nets, which dangled precariously over the side of the ship. The heavy haul of strange, shimmering fish thrashed and writhed in the mesh, their luminous bodies casting eerie, shifting patterns of light across the deck. "Get those lines in," Jonas roared, his voice barely audible over the din of the winches and the rushing water. "We're trying," Henry shouted, his hands raw and bleeding as he struggled with the winch controls. "It's too heavy." Elias glanced out at the water, his jaw tightening. The ocean around the Wanderer had become a roiling cauldron of foam and light. The alien creatures beneath the surface swirled around the ship in impossible formations, their glowing bodies moving in synchronized, hypnotic patterns. "Captain," Jonas yelled, snapping Elias out of his trance. "We're going to sink if we don't cut the nets." Elias hesitated, his mind racing. The haul in those nets was unlike anything they had ever seen, an unimaginable fortune. To cut the lines now would mean throwing away everything they had worked for. "Not yet," he said through gritted teeth. "We can handle this. Just keep pulling." Jonas stared at him in disbelief. "You're going to get us killed." "I said pull," Elias roared, slamming his fist on the console. The crew obeyed, their movements frantic as they hauled the nets closer to the deck. The cables groaned under the strain, the machinery vibrating as the winches fought to lift the impossibly heavy load. But the flooding continued. Below deck, the scene was even worse. Water gushed into the lower compartments, cascading through the failing bulkheads and pooling in the engine room. The pumps worked furiously, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble. Mike waded through the rising water, his boots slipping on the slick metal floor. He reached the pump controls and flipped the switches, cursing under his breath as the machinery sputtered and groaned. "Come on, you piece of junk," he muttered, slamming his fist against the control panel. The pumps roared to life, but the water level barely budged. It was coming in too fast. Mike turned and sprinted back up the stairs, his heart pounding. When he reached the deck, the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The nets were almost aboard, their bulging mass hanging precariously over the side of the ship. But the alien creatures caught in the mesh were unlike anything he had imagined. Their long, sinuous bodies twisted and writhed, their glowing eyes fixed on the crew with an unsettling intelligence. One of the creatures let out a low, resonant sound, a deep hum that seemed to vibrate through the air and water alike. The crew froze, their movements slowing as the sound washed over them. "What the hell are these things?" Mike muttered, his voice barely audible. On the bridge, Elias watched in grim silence as the nets finally reached the deck. The fish spilled out in a shimmering, writhing mass, their iridescent scales casting an otherworldly glow across the metal surface. But the crew's relief was short-lived. The creatures were not content to remain trapped. One of them, a massive, eel-like being with glowing fins and razor-sharp teeth, lunged at the nearest crewman, its body coiling around his leg. The man screamed, thrashing wildly as the creature's grip tightened. "Get it off him," Jonas yelled, grabbing a nearby gaff hook and rushing to the man's aid. He swung the hook with all his might, striking the creature and forcing it to release its hold. The deck erupted into chaos. The alien beings thrashed and snapped, their movements growing more violent as they struggled against the confines of the nets. The crew fought desperately to contain them, their fear and panic driving them to the edge of madness. "We have to get rid of them," Jonas shouted, his voice rising above the cacophony. "Cut the damn nets, Captain." Elias hesitated, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. The haul represented everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. To let it go now would be to admit defeat, to return to port empty-handed and face the scorn of his peers. But as the third watertight compartment began to flood, he realized he had no choice. "Cut the nets," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Jonas didn't wait for further instructions. He grabbed a knife and slashed at the thick ropes holding the nets in place. The tension released with a loud snap, and the nets tumbled over the side, spilling their contents back into the sea. The alien creatures vanished beneath the waves, their glowing bodies disappearing into the depths. The water around the Wanderer grew calm once more, the rhythmic thrum fading into silence. The crew stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and drawn. The ship was listing heavily to port, the flooded compartments threatening to drag it under at any moment. Elias sank into his chair, his head in his hands. They had survived, but at what cost? "We're not out of this yet," Jonas said grimly. "We need to patch those bulkheads and get the pumps running, or we're going down." Elias nodded, his jaw tightening. He rose to his feet and turned to face the crew. "Get to work," he said, his voice firm. "We're not sinking. Not today." Chapter 5, A Desperate Retreat. The Wanderer was barely holding together. The listing ship creaked and groaned, its strained hull sounding like the death knell of an old warrior. Despite the nets being cut loose and the alien creatures gone, the damage was done. 3 compartments were flooded, and the pumps were struggling to keep up. The battered vessel wasn't built for this level of stress. Elias stood on the bridge, gripping the wheel as though it were his lifeline. His voice crackled through the intercom, echoing down to the drenched, exhausted crew on the deck. "Pull yourselves together," he barked. "We need to stabilize the ship and head back to port. Jonas, what's the status below deck?" Jonas climbed back to the bridge, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse. "Pumps are running, but it's not enough. Water's still pouring in. If we don't seal off those compartments, we're going to lose the ship." Elias clenched his teeth. "Then seal them." Jonas shook his head. "We'd have to send someone below to patch the bulkheads. The water's up to the waist in some places. If it rises any higher," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew the risk. Elias slammed his fist against the console, frustration boiling over. "Damn it. Get everyone topside, then. We'll limp back to port and pray this old girl holds together long enough." Jonas hesitated. "We've still got time to try patching it." Elias shot him a sharp look. "Do you want to send someone to their death? We've pushed too far already. This is on me. I'm not gambling with another life." Jonas nodded reluctantly. "Understood." The crew worked tirelessly, rigging temporary measures to stabilize the ship as best they could. Tarps and spare cables were lashed to failing sections, slowing the intake of water but not stopping it. Every few minutes, the pumps sputtered, threatening to quit entirely before roaring back to life. On deck, Bill muttered angrily as he coiled a line. "This is suicide, Mike. The damn ship's sinking, and the captain's dragging us deeper into the middle of nowhere." "Shut up, Bill," Mike snapped, his massive hands gripping a crowbar as he pried a jammed winch free. "We're still breathing, aren't we? The captain's the only reason we're alive right now." Bill scoffed. "Alive? For how long? This whole trip's been cursed. Those things down there, they weren't fish. They weren't anything we should have messed with." "Enough," Jonas barked, storming onto the deck. "You think whining's going to patch the hull? Save it for when we're back on land. Until then, you follow orders, or you go overboard. Your call." Bill glared at him but said nothing more, slamming a coil of rope down in frustration. As the Wanderer turned back toward what they hoped was safety, the tension on board was palpable. The rhythmic thrum from before had faded, but the silence that replaced it felt worse. It wasn't just the sound of the struggling ship, it was the weight of the crew's fear. The sea had grown darker. The rolling waves seemed heavier, their peaks foaming with an unnatural brilliance. The faint bioluminescent glow that had accompanied the alien creatures was gone, but it felt as though the ocean itself had absorbed their presence. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Jonas must have sensed it too. He came to stand beside the captain, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Something's not right," he muttered. Elias glanced at him sharply. "You feel it too?" Jonas nodded. "It's too quiet. The ocean's different." He hesitated before adding, "and the water's colder. I can feel it in my bones." Elias didn't respond. He couldn't afford to let his fear show. Instead, He tightened his grip on the wheel and focused on the course ahead. "Stay sharp," he said. "If there's something out there, I want to know about it before it finds us." Hours passed, and the Wanderer limped forward, its engines sputtering but holding. The crew took turns at the pumps, working in shifts to keep the water level manageable. Tension remained high, but for a time, it seemed as though they might make it back. Then the lights returned. It started with a faint glow beneath the water, barely visible against the inky blackness of the sea. At first, the crew thought it was a trick of the light moonlight reflecting off the waves, perhaps, or the lingering effects of exhaustion. But as the glow grew brighter, it became clear that something was moving beneath them. "Captain!" Henry shouted from the bow, his voice cracking with panic. "We've got something in the water." Elias rushed to the window, his heart sinking as he saw the glowing shapes swirling beneath the ship. They were smaller than the massive creatures they had seen earlier, but there were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds. "What the hell do they want?" Jonas muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. Elias shook his head. "I don't know. But they're not getting it." He grabbed the intercom. "All hands on deck. Get ready for anything." The crew scrambled, arming themselves with whatever they could find, gaff hooks, crowbars, even flare guns. The glowing shapes beneath the water grew closer, their movements erratic and purposeful. The rhythmic thrum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through the ship like a heartbeat. Then the first impact came. A massive jolt shook the Wanderer, nearly knocking the crew off their feet. The lights beneath the water flared brighter, their shapes becoming more defined. The alien creatures were smaller than the ones they had seen before, but no less terrifying. Their sleek, glowing bodies darted through the water with unnatural speed, slamming into the hull like living battering rams. "They're trying to sink us," Bill shouted, his voice tinged with hysteria. "Hold steady." Elias roared, gripping the wheel as the ship lurched to one side. "Don't let them scare you." But fear was spreading quickly. The crew fought to keep their footing as the ship was buffeted by wave after wave of impacts. Water sprayed over the deck, soaking them to the bone and making the metal surface dangerously slick. "They're targeting the weak spots," Jonas yelled, his voice barely audible over the noise. "They know where we're vulnerable." Elias's mind raced. How could they know? How could creatures like this possess such intelligence? The answer didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. "Full throttle," Elias shouted, slamming the throttle lever forward. The engines roared, coughing and sputtering as they strained against the weight of the flooding compartments. The Wanderer surged forward, its battered hull slicing through the waves. The glowing creatures gave chase, their lights flickering like predatory eyes in the dark. "Keep going," Jonas shouted. "Don't stop." Elias didn't need to be told twice. The ship's engines screamed in protest, but the Wanderer pressed on, leaving a trail of foaming water and flickering lights in its wake. For now, they were alive. But as Elias looked out at the endless expanse of dark water, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean wasn't done with them yet. Chapter 6, Rising Terrors. The Wanderer pushed forward, its engines straining with every passing moment. Elias kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the throttle lever as if sheer force of will could keep the old trawler moving. The groaning hull was punctuated by the relentless impacts of the alien creatures slamming into the ship's underside, each hit vibrating through the deck like the ocean itself was trying to tear them apart. The glowing lights beneath the water swarmed like a living storm, their movements erratic and deliberate. They weren't just creatures, they were hunters, intelligent and relentless. Jonas climbed into the bridge, his face grim. He braced himself against the doorway as another impact rocked the ship. "They're not giving up, Captain," he said. "If anything, they're getting more aggressive. We can't take much more of this." Elias didn't look at him. His eyes were locked on the horizon, searching for any sign of salvation. But there was nothing. No land, no ships, just the vast, unbroken expanse of the ocean. "We're not stopping," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "As long as the engines hold, we keep going." Jonas hesitated. "And if they don't?" Elias finally turned to him, his eyes hard. "Then we sink. But we don't stop." On the deck, the crew was in chaos. The glowing creatures were no longer content to stay beneath the surface. They were rising. The first one broke through the water with a deafening splash, its sleek, glowing body glistening in the dim light. It was unlike anything the crew had ever seen, part fish, part serpent, its long, sinuous form covered in bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. It lunged onto the deck with unnatural speed, its glowing fins slicing through the air. Henry barely had time to react before the creature was on him, its jaws snapping inches from his face. "Get it off me," he screamed, scrambling backward as the creature coiled around his leg. Mike rushed forward, swinging a crowbar with all his strength. The metal connected with the creature's body, emitting a sickening crack. The alien being let out a high-pitched screech, its glowing patterns flaring brightly before it released Henry and slithered back toward the edge of the deck. But it wasn't alone. More of the creatures surged onto the ship, their glowing forms cutting through the darkness like knives of light. The crew fought desperately, using whatever they could find to fend off the attackers. Hooks, crowbars, even bare fists, they fought with the desperation of men who knew their lives depended on it. "Hold the line," Jonas shouted, joining the fray with a gaff hook in hand. "Don't let them take the deck." Elias watched from the bridge, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The Wanderer was under siege, its crew fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't hope to understand. But it wasn't just the creatures that worried him. It was the lights. They were getting brighter. The ocean around the ship was glowing now, the water lit from within by an otherworldly radiance. The rhythmic thrum that had haunted them since the nets were first dropped was louder than ever, vibrating through the air and water like the pulse of a living organism. Elias felt it in his chest, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat. It was almost hypnotic, pulling at the edges of his mind, whispering to him in a language he couldn't understand. He shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. "Captain," Jonas shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We can't hold them off much longer." Elias glanced down at the deck. The crew was being overwhelmed. The creatures were everywhere, their glowing bodies twisting and writhing as they attacked with terrifying speed and precision. He grabbed the intercom. "Pull back to the bridge. Now." The crew hesitated, unwilling to abandon the deck. "That's an order," Elias barked. Reluctantly, the men retreated, fighting their way back toward the bridge. The creatures pursued them, their glowing forms cutting through the darkness like streaks of light. Mike was the last to make it inside, slamming the door shut behind him just as one of the creatures lunged. Its jaws snapped shut inches from his face, and he stumbled backward, panting heavily. "They're everywhere," he said, his voice shaking. "We're not getting out of this, Captain." Elias ignored him, his mind racing. The ship was surrounded, the creatures relentless. But there had to be a way out. "There's always a way out," he muttered to himself. The lights outside the bridge grew brighter, their glow filling the room with an eerie, shifting radiance. The crew watched in stunned silence as the creatures surrounded the ship, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Then, something changed. The rhythmic thrum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the air like the tolling of a giant bell. The lights outside the ship flared, blindingly bright, and the water began to churn violently. "What the hell is happening?" Jonas muttered, shielding his eyes from the light. Elias didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the water, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The ocean was rising. A massive shape emerged from the depths, its glowing form dwarfing the Wanderer. It was unlike anything they had seen before, an enormous, otherworldly being that seemed to defy all logic and reason. Its body was a swirling mass of light and shadow, its glowing eyes staring down at the ship with an intelligence that was both alien and terrifying. The crew froze, their terror palpable. What is that?" Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. The creature let out a low, resonant sound, the same deep hum they had heard before but magnified 1,000-fold. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seemed to reach into their very souls. The lights inside the ship flickered, and the Wanderer groaned under the pressure of the creature's presence. Elias gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the wheel. "We're not going down without a fight," he said, his voice firm. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. Chapter 7, The Visitors from the Abyss. The massive alien presence loomed over the Wanderer, casting its blinding glow across the sea. The crew stood frozen in the bridge, their terror eclipsing any remaining shred of resolve. The colossal creature's form was mesmerizing, constantly shifting and reshaping itself, as though its body existed in a dimension only partially comprehensible to human eyes. The smaller creatures that had attacked the ship earlier circled it in synchronized patterns, their glowing bodies flickering in unison with the massive being's rhythmic hum. The sound seemed to fill the air, the water, and even the thoughts of those aboard the Wanderer. Elias felt the vibration in his chest, growing stronger with each pulse. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The massive alien being wasn't attacking, it was observing. Watching. Studying them. "What do we do, Captain?" Jonas asked, his voice trembling. Elias didn't respond immediately. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature. Then it moved. The enormous being lowered itself toward the ship, its glowing tendrils reaching out like fingers. The water churned violently as it descended, and the ship rocked dangerously. The crew stumbled, clinging to whatever they could as the vibrations grew stronger. The smaller creatures darted in and out of the water, their synchronized movements forming intricate patterns around the ship. "What is it doing?" Mike shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Testing us," Elias muttered under his breath. Jonas turned to him, his face pale. "Testing us? For what?" Elias shook his head. He didn't have an answer, but he could feel the creature's intent. It wasn't mindless. It wasn't attacking for the sake of destruction. It was deliberate. Purposeful. The first tendril touched the ship. A brilliant flash of light erupted as it made contact, and the air was filled with a deafening, otherworldly sound. The crew covered their ears, crying out in pain as the sound reverberated through the ship. Elias gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain upright. He could feel the vibration in his bones, in his very thoughts. It wasn't just a sound, it was a communication. And then, he understood. The light faded, and the sound subsided, leaving the crew gasping for breath. The massive creature hovered above the ship, its tendrils retreating into its glowing form. Elias staggered forward, gripping the console for support. His mind was racing, struggling to process what had just happened. "They're not here to kill us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The crew stared at him in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Henry demanded. "Did you see what they did to the ship? To us?" Elias shook his head. "They could have destroyed us already if they wanted to. This is something else." Jonas frowned. "Something else? Like what?" Elias hesitated, searching for the right words. "A message. They're trying to communicate." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The idea was absurd, terrifying, even. But deep down, they couldn't deny it. The creatures weren't just attacking. They were reaching out. The rhythmic hum returned, softer now, almost soothing. The massive being tilted its form, its glowing eyes locking onto Elias. He felt a strange sensation wash over him, a mixture of awe and fear, as though he were standing in the presence of something far beyond his comprehension. The creature's tendrils began to move again, this time slower, more deliberate. They extended toward the ship, but they didn't touch it. Instead, they hovered just above the surface, pulsating with light. And then, the visions began. Elias gasped, clutching his head as a flood of images filled his mind. He saw vast, alien landscapes, towering crystalline structures, endless oceans of light, and skies filled with swirling, multicolored storms. He saw creatures like the one before him, moving through these otherworldly environments with grace and purpose. But he also saw destruction. The images shifted, showing cataclysmic events, the crystalline structures shattering, the oceans boiling away, the skies consumed by darkness. The creatures fled, their glowing forms dimming as their world collapsed around them. And then, silence. Elias stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The visions faded, leaving him shaken and disoriented. Captain, Jonas said, his voice filled with concern. What happened? Elias looked up at the creature, his expression one of both fear and understanding. They're refugees, he said. They lost their world, and now they're here. The crew was silent, the weight of Elias's words sinking in. Refugees. The idea was almost too much to comprehend. Refugees? Mike repeated, his brow furrowed. From where? Another planet. Elias nodded. Another world. One that's gone now. Jonas frowned. And they think we can help them. How? We can't even help ourselves. Elias shook his head. I don't think they're asking for help. I think they're warning us. Warning us about what? Henry demanded. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The images were still fresh in his mind, the destruction, the collapse, the end. Whatever had happened to their world, it was coming here. The massive creature let out another low hum, its glowing form pulsing in time with the sound. The smaller creatures began to retreat, their synchronized movements forming a spiral around the ship. The Wanderer rocked gently as the water calmed, the alien lights fading into the depths. They're leaving, Jonas said, his voice filled with relief. Elias watched as the massive being began to sink back into the ocean, its glowing eyes lingering on the ship one last time. They've done what they came to do, he said quietly. And what's that? Mike asked. Elias turned to him, his expression grim. They've shown us what's coming. As the last of the alien lights disappeared into the depths, the Wanderer was left in silence. The crew stood on the bridge, their minds reeling from everything they had just experienced. Elias stared out at the empty ocean, his thoughts racing. The aliens had given them a warning, but what could they do with it? How could they prepare for something so far beyond their understanding? One thing was certain. The world they knew was about to change forever. Chapter 8. The Broken Horizon. The Wanderer drifted in an uneasy silence. The ocean's surface, now still, betrayed none of the chaos that had unfolded moments ago. The air felt heavy, as though the weight of the alien presence still lingered. On the bridge, the crew stood in a disheveled huddle, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Elias turned the wheel slightly, steering the trawler away from the direction the alien lights had vanished. His hands trembled on the wheel, a rare crack in his usually unshakable composure. He knew the crew had questions, hell, he had questions, but the priority was survival. Jonas, Elias said, his voice low but commanding. Check the hull. Make sure we're not taking on any more water. Jonas gave a curt nod and left without a word, though the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. And the rest of you, Elias continued, turning to the others. Get below deck. Rest if you can. We'll need everyone sharp when we figure out our next move. What next move, Captain? Henry snapped, his voice laced with barely contained panic. Did you see what just happened? What's the point in trying to get back? Who's going to believe us? They don't have to believe us, Elias replied sharply. We get back to shore. We repair the boat. One thing at a time. And what about them? Mike interjected, pointing toward the horizon where the creatures had disappeared. You saw what they showed you, didn't you? That vision? Elias met his gaze but said nothing. They destroyed their world, Mike continued. Whatever it was, it's coming here. And you think it's just going to let us sail back and pretend none of this happened? We don't know that. Elias barked, silencing the room. We don't know what's coming or if it's even something we can fight. But I'll be damned if I let this ship go down without a fight. The crew stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. None of them wanted to believe what they'd seen. But denial wasn't an option anymore. Get below deck, Elias repeated, softer this time. That's an order. As the crew dispersed, Elias stayed at the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon. The visions the creature had shown him played over and over in his mind, each one more horrifying than the last. He had seen worlds collapse, civilizations vanish, and countless lives extinguished in an instant. And now, those same creatures had come here. Why? To warn them? To escape? Or to prepare them for what was inevitable? Elias didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. The ocean would never feel the same again. Below deck, Jonas inspected the hull with grim determination. The ship had taken a beating, but it had held together, barely. 3 compartments were still partially flooded, and the bilge pumps were working overtime to keep the water level manageable. He ran his hand along one of the bulkheads, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingertips. The vibrations from the alien presence had been so intense, he half expected to find cracks spiderwebbing across the steel. But the hull held. Somehow, the Wanderer had survived. Jonas leaned against the wall, exhaling heavily. His thoughts drifted to the glowing creature's massive form and the strange hum that had resonated in his chest. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a connection that went beyond words. He didn't tell the others, but he had seen something in the vision too. Not destruction. Not chaos. A choice. Back on the bridge, Elias spotted something on the horizon, a faint glimmer of light. His heart leaped. Was it another ship? A beacon? Jonas, get up here, he called over the intercom. A few moments later, Jonas appeared, his expression wary. What is it? Elias pointed toward the light. Do you see that? Could be a rescue ship. Or maybe a buoy. Jonas squinted, his jaw tightening. It's too steady to be a flare. And it's not moving. Then what is it? Elias asked, gripping the wheel tighter. Jonas shook his head. I don't know. But after what we've been through, I wouldn't assume it's friendly. The Wanderer continued toward the light, its engines groaning under the strain. The closer they got, the more distinct the glow became. It wasn't a beacon or a buoy. It was a structure. Rising from the water was an enormous, monolithic object, its surface smooth and seamless. The light emanated from within, casting an eerie glow across the surrounding waves. What the hell is that? Elias muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. It's not human, Jonas said grimly. The crew gathered on the bridge, staring at the strange structure in silence. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen, towering, alien, and impossibly advanced. Captain, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. We shouldn't be here. Elias nodded, but his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. The structure wasn't just alien, it was purposeful. We've already come this far, he said. Might as well see what's waiting for us. As the Wanderer approached the monolith, the water around it began to glow. The rhythmic hum returned, softer now, but unmistakable. The crew tensed, their fear palpable. They had survived one encounter with the alien creatures, barely. Was this their end? The ship came to a stop a few hundred yards from the structure. The water was eerily calm, the glow reflecting off its surface like liquid light. Then, without warning, the hum grew louder. The monolith began to shift, its smooth surface rippling like water. A section of it opened, revealing a dark void within. The crew watched in stunned silence as a beam of light shot out from the opening, scanning the Wanderer from bow to stern. The beam lingered on the bridge, bathing the crew in its cold, unearthly glow. What's it doing? Henry whispered, his voice trembling. Judging us, Elias said, his voice heavy. The light faded, and the monolith was still once more. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing would happen. Then, a voice. It wasn't a sound in the air, but a presence in their minds, a deep, resonant tone that carried with it a weight of unimaginable intelligence. You are not ready. The words echoed in their thoughts, clear and undeniable. The monolith began to sink, its glowing form disappearing into the depths. The water churned violently, and the Wanderer rocked dangerously. Brace yourselves, Elias shouted, gripping the wheel as the ship was tossed by the waves. Within moments, the monolith was gone, leaving no trace of its existence. The ocean was silent once more. Elias stared at the empty water, his mind racing. What does that mean? Jonas asked, breaking the silence. We're not ready for what? Elias didn't answer. The warning was clear, but the details were not. Whatever was coming, they weren't prepared. But they would have to be. Chapter 9, Shadows in the Depths. The Wanderer moved sluggishly through the water, its engines wheezing as if exhausted from the nightmarish encounter. Elias stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, though his mind wandered far beyond it. The message from the monolith, "You are not ready," rang in his head like a bell that refused to be silenced. What weren't they ready for? And how could they prepare for something they didn't understand? The crew had fallen into a tense silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. No one dared speak about what they'd seen, let alone what it meant. The ocean felt darker now, heavier. Even in daylight, the water seemed to shimmer with an unnatural hue, as though it were hiding secrets too terrible to reveal. Jonas emerged from below deck, his face grim. "The bilge pumps are holding, but barely. We've got another few hours before we'll need to cut the engines and siphon some of the pressure manually." Elias nodded absently. "We'll stop soon. I just want to get as far from that place as we can." Jonas hesitated. "Captain, we need to talk." Elias glanced at him. "About what?" Jonas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You saw the same thing I did, didn't you? In that vision?" Elias stiffened. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to relive the images that had been burned into his mind. But Jonas was relentless. It wasn't just destruction, Jonas pressed. There was something else. Something they didn't show the others. Elias clenched his jaw. He'd seen it too, though he wasn't sure if he could put it into words. Among the chaos and ruin of the alien world, there had been a glimmer of something else, a choice, an opportunity. But what did it mean? And why had the creatures shown it to him and Jonas specifically? "We'll talk about it later," Elias said finally. "Right now, I need you to keep the crew calm. They're on the edge as it is." Jonas nodded reluctantly, though the look in his eyes said he wouldn't let the matter drop. As the hours dragged on, the Wanderer limped toward what they hoped was safety. The radio was still dead, and no ships or planes had appeared on the horizon. The crew had begun to wonder if they were alone out here, if whatever had destroyed the aliens' world had already started its work on theirs. Mike stood at the bow, staring into the water. The sunlight barely penetrated the surface, and what little light did seemed to bend and twist unnaturally. He rubbed his eyes, certain he was imagining things. But when he looked again, the shapes were still there, faint, flickering shadows moving beneath the waves. "Captain," he called, his voice tight with panic. "You need to see this." Elias and Jonas joined him at the bow, peering into the water. At first, they saw nothing. But then the shapes came into focus, dark, serpentine forms slithering just below the surface, circling the ship like predators sizing up their prey. "What the hell are those?" Jonas whispered. "They're watching us," Elias said grimly. He didn't know how he knew, but he was certain of it. These creatures weren't mindless, they were waiting for something. The rest of the crew gathered at the rail, their fear mounting as the shadows grew bolder, rising closer to the surface. One of them broke the water, a sleek, black body covered in bioluminescent patterns that pulsed rhythmically, almost hypnotically. Its head was elongated, its eyes large and unblinking, filled with an intelligence that sent a chill down Elias's spine. "They're not the same as the others," Jonas said. "These are different." "Different how?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. Jonas shook his head. "I don't know. But I don't think they're here to help." The creatures began to close in, their movements growing more erratic. The Wanderer rocked as one of them brushed against the hull, its glowing patterns illuminating the water like a sinister light show. "Everyone, get inside," Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Now." The crew scrambled to obey, retreating to the bridge as the shadows swarmed around the ship. The vibrations returned, faint at first but quickly intensifying. The walls of the bridge rattled, and the air seemed to thrum with an otherworldly energy. "Captain, what do we do?" Henry asked, his eyes wide with fear. Elias gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The creatures hadn't attacked yet, but it was only a matter of time. They needed to act, and fast. "Jonas, get to the engine room," Elias said. "See if you can give us more speed." Jonas hesitated. "If I push the engines any harder, they'll blow." "Then let them blow," Elias snapped. "We're not staying here." Jonas nodded and rushed off, leaving Elias to face the crew. "The rest of you, secure the deck. If anything tries to get on board, you fight it off. No hesitation." The men nodded, though their fear was evident. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, knives, wrenches, even pieces of broken equipment. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. In the engine room, Jonas worked frantically, sweat pouring down his face as he adjusted valves and bypassed safety systems. The engines roared in protest, but the ship began to pick up speed. On the bridge, Elias gripped the wheel, his eyes locked on the horizon. The creatures were keeping pace, their glowing forms weaving through the water like phantoms. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Just a little farther." But the creatures weren't about to let them go. One of them surged forward, its sleek body cutting through the water like a torpedo. It rammed the hull, sending a shudder through the ship. "We're not going to make it," Mike shouted. "Hold on," Elias barked. Another impact rocked the ship, this one harder than the first. The lights flickered, and the bridge filled with the sound of groaning metal. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vibrations stopped. The creatures retreated, their glowing forms disappearing into the depths. "What's happening?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't answer. He didn't dare hope that it was over. The water was eerily calm, the only sound the steady hum of the engines. The crew gathered on the bridge, their faces pale and drawn. "Why did they leave?" Mike asked. "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But I don't think we scared them off." Jonas returned, wiping grease from his hands. "Engines are holding for now, but we're running on borrowed time. We need to find land." Elias nodded. "Agreed. Everyone, stay alert. Whatever scared those things off might be worse than they are." The crew exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The Wanderer pushed on, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. But deep in the water, something was following. Something larger. And it was waiting. Chapter 10, The Abyss Awakens. The ocean, vast and empty as it was, felt closer now, tighter, as though the waves themselves were watching them. The Wanderer moved like a wounded animal, its engines struggling against the weight of their fear. Elias stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon in a futile attempt to find something that could offer a glimmer of hope. But all he saw was endless water. The crew had fallen into a rhythm, working silently but with a sense of urgency. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not after what they'd encountered. Not when the creatures were still out there, following them like shadows beneath the surface. They were too quiet. Too patient. And somewhere below, something was stirring. Jonas wiped sweat from his brow, his hands shaking as he checked the ship's systems once again. The engines were working at full capacity, but the vibrations were becoming more frequent. It was subtle at first, but now he could feel it in the walls, the floor beneath his feet. It wasn't just the creatures, they were no longer alone. There was something else down there. Something ancient. He could feel it. Jonas ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The creatures had retreated, yes, but they hadn't left. And what if, instead of fleeing, they were simply waiting for something? What if there was something else lurking beneath the Wanderer, something far worse than the glowing predators they'd already faced? Jonas shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. No. He couldn't think like that. Not now. They had to keep going. They had to find land. If only for the chance to breathe again. On the bridge, Elias gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles white. The sea had grown still, and with it, an eerie silence filled the air. He couldn't help but feel as though they were crossing a threshold, a line that, once crossed, would be impossible to return from. "Captain," Mike said, his voice barely audible. "We've been heading west for hours. Shouldn't we be seeing land soon?" Elias glanced at the horizon, which was as empty as it had been since they'd left the area where they first encountered the creatures. He shook his head. "We're in the middle of nowhere. No landmarks. No islands. The radio's still dead, and the GPS is shot." Henry stepped forward, a worried frown etched on his face. "And what if the creatures, what if they're not just following us? What if they're pushing us somewhere? Someplace we're not supposed to go?" Elias's eyes flickered toward the radar. The screen was empty, save for a few scattered blips that could have been debris or the faintest signs of underwater activity. But there was no land in sight. "They're not pushing us anywhere," Elias said, his voice steadier than he felt. "They've shown us what they can do, but they haven't attacked. They're not interested in us, not yet. Whatever they are, they're not the ones we should be worried about." Mike and Henry exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared question Elias. If anything, the captain's conviction made them feel a little less lost, though they all knew deep down that the worst had yet to come. Below deck, Jonas continued to monitor the ship's systems. The vibrations were becoming stronger now, impossible to ignore. They weren't coming from the engines or the hull, these were more like tremors, reverberating from deep below the ocean's surface. He tried to dismiss it, tried to rationalize it, but his gut was telling him something had changed. Then, the lights flickered. It was a minor glitch, nothing too unusual for a ship in rough conditions. But Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that something had just crossed the line into the impossible. The vibration was growing. He could feel it in his bones now. It wasn't just the water, the entire world beneath the Wanderer seemed to be stirring. Then, without warning, a screech tore through the hull. A sound so deafening, so alien, that Jonas froze. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural. It was something else, a high-pitched, shrill noise that made his teeth ache. He bolted to the engine room hatch, his pulse pounding in his ears. On the bridge, Elias felt it, too. The screech reverberated through the ship, rattling the windows and vibrating the floorboards beneath their feet. The air seemed to warp, thick and heavy, like a storm was rolling in. "What the hell is that?" Mike shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "It's coming from below," Henry said, his face pale. Something's down there." Elias looked at the radar. The blips were no longer scattered, they were forming a pattern, circling the ship. A slow, deliberate circle. The creatures were back. But this time, it wasn't just them. Something else was rising from the deep. Jonas reached the engine room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the ship vibrating more violently now, like something massive was shifting beneath them. He ran to the control panel and tried to override the emergency shutdown. The lights flickered again, then went completely out. The hum of the engines stopped abruptly, plunging the ship into darkness. The vibration grew worse. Then, a loud, bone-rattling crash echoed through the hull. Jonas grabbed the nearest wrench, his hands slick with sweat. The ship shuddered violently, and the lights flickered back on, but only dimly. A cold, blue glow began to fill the engine room from beneath the floor, seeping through cracks in the steel. He backed away slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. The ocean itself was rising up, like something trying to break through. Something ancient. Something monstrous. And it was coming for them. On the bridge, Elias could feel it in his chest, the pressure, the dread. The air felt thick, charged. Every instinct told him that they were no longer just drifting on the water. They were drifting toward something. The creatures were moving faster now, their patterns shifting, as if coordinating with whatever was coming. Elias slammed his fist on the wheel. "Jonas," he shouted. "Get back up here." But the radio was dead. The ship was silent, save for the low, almost imperceptible hum that had started to fill the air. The hum wasn't from the engines. It was coming from beneath them. From the depths of the ocean. Then, a deep, resonating roar came from below, a sound that shook the ship to its core. It was like nothing Elias had ever heard, as though the ocean itself were waking up, coming alive. And with that, the water beneath them began to churn. Waves rose and fell in unnatural patterns, and the Wanderer rocked violently, as if caught in the grasp of something far larger than the ship could handle. Elias tightened his grip on the wheel. "Hold on. Get ready for anything." In the depths, something stirred. Something vast. Something ancient. It had been waiting for millennia, and now, it was rising. And it was angry. Chapter 11, The Reckoning. The ship trembled again, as though the ocean beneath had turned into a living, breathing creature intent on swallowing them whole. The Wanderer bucked and swayed like a toy boat caught in a storm, but the sky above was as still and clear as ever. It was the sea that had turned, a vast and unseen force manipulating the world beneath them. Elias's hands were shaking as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, but he didn't dare let go. The Wanderer was all they had left. Everything else, their hope, their future, was sinking fast, just like the ship below them. The creaking of the ship's hull echoed throughout the bridge as the vibrations continued to intensify. The low hum that had filled the air now morphed into a deep growl, reverberating through the walls and floorboards. It was a sound that came from the depths of the ocean, ancient and primal. And then came the screech, the same screech from earlier, but louder. Closer. It seemed to pierce the air, a sound that made their bones ache, a pitch so high and so alien that it was almost unbearable. It felt as if the very ocean itself was protesting their presence, as though it had been disturbed by something that had slumbered for too long. Elias's breath hitched in his chest. What was down there? He had an awful, sinking feeling that the alien creatures they had seen earlier weren't the only things the ocean had hidden from them. That screech, that horrible, terrible screech, whatever it was coming from deep within the abyss. His mind raced as his eyes searched the darkening water. Something was rising, and it wasn't just a school of fish or an undersea predator. This was something far bigger, far older, and it wasn't happy to be disturbed. Jonas burst through the door to the bridge, his face pale and wild-eyed. "Captain, we need to go. We need to get out of here now." Elias didn't even look at him. He was too busy trying to steady the ship, but the controls felt unresponsive, the wheel jerking in his hands as if the ship were no longer in his control. The tremors from below were growing, pulsing now, with increasing regularity, like the beating of a gigantic heart. "What's going on below?" Elias asked, his voice strained. "There's something huge down there," Jonas said, his breath coming in short gasps. I don't know how to explain it. The engines are failing, Captain. The systems are going haywire. We've got no control." Elias's heart sank. They were completely at the mercy of whatever was lurking beneath the waves. And it wasn't friendly. Whatever had been waiting for them had awakened. The crew gathered nervously in the bridge, exchanging fearful glances. Mike, his face ashen, leaned over the rail and peered into the water, trying to discern what was happening beneath the surface. But all he could see were shadows, giant, writhing shadows moving beneath the hull. "They're here," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever they are, they're here." Jonas, still standing by the engine controls, turned toward Elias, his face tight with panic. "We have to get out of here, Captain. We're not gonna make it much longer." Elias shook his head, a cold resolve settling over him. "No. We're not running from this. We face it. Whatever's down there, it's coming for us, but we can't keep running." Jonas stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean, face it? We can't fight whatever that thing is. It's..." Before he could finish, a massive shockwave hit the ship from below, sending them all sprawling to the floor. The Wanderer groaned and shook violently, its hull screeching under the pressure. Elias's heart nearly stopped as he felt the ship tilt just for a moment before it righted itself, but it was enough to confirm his worst fear. Something was lifting the ship from below. "We're being pulled down," Elias shouted, scrambling to his feet. But even as he said it, he felt the unmistakable sensation of weightlessness. The Wanderer was no longer floating atop the water. It was sinking. Slowly, at first, but with each passing moment, the descent quickened. The water was no longer calm. The surface churned, turning into a violent maelstrom as waves collided with one another, each one growing taller, more forceful, as though the ocean itself had turned into a storm. But there was no storm in the sky, just the twisting, writhing water beneath them, as if something below was stirring the currents with an almost deliberate rage. "Hold on," Elias shouted, grabbing the wheel to steady the ship, but it was no use. The water was swallowing them. The engine was sputtering, and the ship's lights flickered again, casting erratic shadows over the terrified crew. Jonas stumbled toward the emergency hatch, looking back at Elias. "We can't stay here, Captain. We've got to abandon ship." Elias felt a moment of hesitation, a split second of doubt, but he shook it off. "No. We're not abandoning her yet." He could feel it now. The pull from below was stronger, like an invisible hand pulling the ship down into the abyss. Something had risen, and it wasn't going to let them escape. "Captain, please." Jonas's voice cracked. We don't stand a chance if we don't get out of here now. Just then, another deafening screech echoed through the ship, louder than any of the previous sounds. It rattled their teeth and filled their heads with a ringing, disorienting noise. Then came the terrible, reverberating sound of something massive pushing against the hull, a deep groan as though the ocean was splitting itself open. The ship lurched again, this time with more force. Elias staggered, barely managing to keep his footing. "Get to the lifeboats," he ordered. "No," Mike shouted, his face contorted with fear. "It's too late. It's already too late." As if on cue, the ocean seemed to respond, sending another violent shock through the ship, slamming the crew to the ground. The ship tilted sharply, and they heard the unmistakable sound of cracking metal. The Wanderer was breaking apart. Elias stood tall, gripping the wheel with both hands, his mind made up. "We're not giving up. Not yet. We fight." But the ship was already sinking too quickly. The water was rising, filling the lower decks, the sound of rushing water deafening as it surged through the hallways. Then, the shadow beneath the water rose to the surface. It wasn't just one creature anymore. It was many, countless glowing eyes and twisting forms, a mass of alien shapes moving together in a terrifying harmony. It was a creature beyond description, something that should never have been seen by human eyes. And it was coming for them. The ocean roared as the massive shadow rose higher, and with it, an unearthly voice echoed in Elias's mind. "You are not prepared. But you will learn." The ship tilted one final time as the sea swallowed them whole. Chapter 12, The Final Depths. The sea had swallowed them whole. The Wanderer was gone, crushed beneath the weight of an ocean that had become more alive, more vengeful with each passing moment. Elias had seen it. Seen the creature. The enormous shadow that rose from the depths. It was something beyond his understanding, something that transcended the very nature of life as he knew it. They had fought, but the ocean had no mercy. The cold water was now a reality, rushing in through the ship's ruptured hull, flooding the decks faster than they could comprehend. There was no escape, no turning back. The Wanderer had become a broken, sinking monument to their futile resistance. Elias gasped as water filled his lungs. He reached out instinctively, grasping the last remnants of the wrecked vessel, his fingers slipping against the cold metal. His vision blurred, and his head spun as his body fought against the overwhelming weight of the sea. It was dragging him down, pulling him toward the bottomless depths where no human should ever tread. "Captain." Jonas's voice reached him through the watery chaos. "Captain, we need to get out." Elias forced his eyes open, seeing Jonas a few feet away, struggling against the current. There was no time for hesitation. With a final, desperate burst of strength, Elias pulled himself toward the surface. The world above was a dark blur, a flicker of light that seemed impossibly distant. But he reached for it, pushing himself forward with every ounce of willpower he had left. They were no longer on the Wanderer, they were swimming, struggling against the immense pull of the sea. The lifeboats were gone, shattered along with the ship. The crew was scattered, clinging to floating debris and bits of wreckage. The vast, unrelenting water was the only thing left now, stretching out endlessly in every direction. Above them, the sky had turned a deep, impenetrable black, as if the heavens themselves had been swallowed by the night. Jonas was beside him, his face pale and desperate as he kicked toward a floating piece of debris. "There's nothing out there, Captain," he shouted over the roar of the waves. "We're alone. We've lost everything." Elias's heart sank as he looked around, but he couldn't allow himself to feel defeated. "Not yet. We're not alone," he said, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "We're still here." Jonas glanced over at the dark expanse of the ocean. He shook his head, his expression broken. "The creatures, they'll find us. They're still down there, waiting." Elias felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He knew Jonas was right. They had seen the creatures, their glowing eyes, their terrifying forms, and that sound. That god-awful, unearthly screech that reverberated through the ship, through their minds. But there was something more. Something far worse that had emerged from the depths, the thing that had dragged the Wanderer into the abyss. It was like a dark god, a force of nature that had awakened after millennia of slumber. And it wasn't finished with them yet. A shadow passed beneath the water. Elias froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. The faintest ripple spread through the sea around them. He turned quickly to look at Jonas. "Get ready," he hissed, pulling himself up onto the floating debris, his heart pounding in his chest. "They're coming." A cold, alien presence filled the water around them. It was like being watched by something older than the world itself. Something vast, far beyond their understanding. It moved beneath the surface, shifting the water with its presence. Elias didn't need to see it to know it was there. He could feel it in his bones, like an unearthly pressure that pushed against his mind. Then, it rose again. The water churned violently, and from the depths, the shadow emerged. It wasn't a creature anymore, it was a monstrosity, a twisting, sprawling mass of unknown forms. It seemed to be made of the sea itself, its shape shifting with every passing moment, as if it were composed of countless writhing entities, each one distinct but part of the same vast whole. Glowing eyes, sharp tendrils, and spiraling bodies extended from the mass, reaching upward, as if it were trying to pull the very essence of the ocean into itself. Elias felt the unmistakable presence of the creature's mind, a vast intelligence that pushed against his own thoughts. It was ancient, older than any civilization, older than humanity itself. And it was aware of them. It knew they were there. In a blur of motion, Jonas screamed, his voice cutting through the silence that had descended. "Captain, help! Help me!" Elias turned, and his stomach lurched. Jonas was struggling in the water, but he wasn't alone. From beneath the surface, tendrils, dark, sleek, and impossibly fast, had wrapped around his legs, pulling him down. Elias's heart pounded as he reached out, trying to grab hold of him, but the water was too violent. The creature was too powerful. "Jonas!" Elias cried, reaching out with everything he had. But the sea was unforgiving. In one final, desperate moment, the water around Jonas exploded, pulling him into the depths. The last thing Elias saw was the fear in his eyes, wide, pleading, and then he was gone, swallowed by the ocean. Elias froze, staring into the endless black abyss where Jonas had disappeared. For a moment, all he could hear was the crashing of waves and his own labored breathing. His entire body was numb. But beneath the numbness, a terrible truth began to settle in. They were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their lives against something that had no place in the world they knew. The water around him grew colder, the tendrils of the creature moving beneath the surface, drawing closer. The glow from beneath the depths brightened, casting an eerie light across the water. The creature wasn't done with them. Not yet. Elias's chest tightened as he realized the terrifying truth. The ocean was alive and it was angry. And there was no way out. The final, terrible screech echoed through the darkness, and the last shred of hope vanished beneath the waves. The Wanderer was lost. The crew was gone. And the ocean had awoken. The end.
Aye, aye. Grandma would always say to me, from I was a little boy, it's all about the spoon inside you. They don't know you. When you are work, them asleep. Better be wise and live. All about the pain and precious too that we go through. Get the youth, be positive, stand up firm and live. The sacrifice we make in life, it's just the thing to set your mind right. Set your mind right. Yeah. So why you really wanna fight? Why you really wanna fight? Rome was built in a one day, so I best we unite. It's all about the soul inside you. They don't know you. When you are work, them asleep. Better be wise and live. All about the pain and precious too that we go through. Get the youth, be positive, stand up firm and live. Fight, fight with all your might. You have a dream, work hard at it day and night. just seems right. Them doing 100%, but easy, you want to do 1,000,000. Let them fight.